Welcome. Please welcome Tim Coomar, our guest lecturer for today. So before giving the mic to Tim, I have to confess that Tim is the reason why I'm here. He was my inspiration. I went to one of his lessons back a long time ago. He was teaching HTML and CSS at that point. I was impressed. I really liked the whole process. So this is how I got into teaching what I love, because I really like web technologies. So Tim is the reason why we are here, I think, today. He's a really great guy. He's a really good friend, and he also is a master in HTML and CSS. So Tim, I think you can talk a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for the invitation, Kostas. And yeah, the feeling is definitely mutual. So I don't know if I would put it this way, but I may be the reason he's here. But Kostas was the guy who taught me a lot of what I know in other areas of web development. And that's something that's actually very fundamental about the web development community, at least the front-end community that I've been involved in. It's a community where you get ahead by helping each other and by coming together. And so even a context like this, like a class, is a good way to start doing that. So I'm very happy to be here. I very, very much enjoy teaching web development, and particularly CSS. Even though I haven't been working professionally building websites for quite a while, although I still build them for friends and for various kind of things that come up, projects that come up. I have, if anything, I've got deeper into the world of web development through teaching over the last few years, just because I love it and I don't want to give it up. So due to limited time, I may not be able to work full time building websites, but I can certainly help others get there. So yeah, that's enough about me, I think. Any other stuff you can find out along the way, maybe at another point. Shall we start?
Yeah, sure.
Okie dokie. Do we want to go and do introductions for the rest of the students, or?
I think I don't know. You can.
As we talk, when you want to say something, you can introduce yourself. Each person who wants to talk, they can introduce themselves, and we can do it that way.
Yeah, I think it's better. So I will be looking at the chat, and if there are any questions, I can just give it up to you. And so you just have to see your screen and work on the code on the presentation. So I will be informing you about any questions. I will be checking the chat. So you can present now.
Yeah, I'm going to.
You need to check present now.
Yeah.
The window, your entire screen. Sorry, your entire screen. Select the screen and click share.
Sorry, it's asking me to give permissions. Let me just give me 1 second.
Yeah, sure.
This is why we should have done a test first, but I got waylaid on my way to setting up. So we would have done a little setup first and a test, but it shouldn't take more than just a few seconds. Let me try again, 1 second. Here we are, got it. Okay,
Okay.
Is it working now?
Yes, we can see your screen. Just to make sure that you are sharing your entire screen, can you switch to like VS Code or another window
No,
to see?
I'm doing everything in the browser, so I'm
Okay,
just
no
showing
problem.
a browser window.
Sure.
What is it that you can actually see?
The Flexbox and the CSS Grid screen.
That's it. And now, can you see CodePen? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, great. So we can start. Right. What is CSS Grid? I understand that you have already familiarized yourself with Flexbox, which is one of the ways that we use to lay out our page when we're building it in CSS. Now, Grid is basically some next level stuff. So in short, Grid is a tool. Do you all know what a Swiss Army knife is? It's one of those little pocket knives that has all the different kind of things. So a Swiss Army knife is a knife that it doesn't do everything, but it does a whole bunch of stuff. And you're able to do more things with it than you could before. And that's what CSS Grid is. It's a tool for laying out the elements on your page. And it gives you a lot more power and a lot more flexibility than we've ever had before. So what I say to my students often is, you guys are entering the space in the golden era of front-end web development. And so I used to give a history, but actually, who cares about the history? You guys won't have to bother with all of the hacky, difficult ways that we used to use for laying out websites. We're just going to go straight into the future. And the good thing about CSS Grid is that you can actually use it right now. Now, when you're going into production sites, building for companies, one of the key things to ask is, what kind of browsers do you need to support? And there are ways of making sure that you can get CSS, your layout to work in older browsers. But basically, all of the current browsers are supporting it, so we can start using it in production now with just one or two caveats. Now, CSS Grid has the same basic idea as Flexbox. So you start by having a container. So you designate an element, like the mother element, as your grid container, and then all of the children of that container become grid items. So you have your grid container, and then you have your grid items, and the only elements that are directly affected by this tool are those children, those grid items. And that's where the fun begins. So the way it works is you set up your grid and the way that it's supposed to behave, and then you can just start laying out your page any way you want in ways that you could never even have dreamed of before. So let's get into it and start looking at our options. So I'm going to make my main element, and I'm going to give it a class of grid container, just so we're describing kind of what we're making as we go along. And I think that's going to be the most helpful way. And I'm sorry.
Excuse me, Tim. Can you bump up a little bit the font size, just one tick?
Yeah. Let me just see. That's probably going to be the easiest way.
Yeah,
is that okay?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
I'm not sure if you can do it in settings as well, but can you do it in settings, editor? No, it has to be like that. Okay. Can everyone see now then what we're making? Now I'm going to put, yes. So I'm gonna just put 15 divs inside here. And I'm gonna use just a quick way of doing it. Sorry. Don't ignore what I'm doing right now. It's just a very quick way of writing HTML, which you don't need to worry about. So I've got 15 divs inside one grid container. Yeah, very, very straightforward. And what I said before at the beginning, so you see we're diving straight into the code here. I'm going to find my grid container, and then I'm going to go display grid. Now that is now a grid container, okay? Now, just before I continue, we want to see what we're doing. So I'm just going to target all of those divs, and I'm going to give them some basic kind of styling so that we can see what we're doing. So I'm just going to give a small amount of padding, and then I'm going to center the text, and then I'm going to give them a very temporary outline, just so we can see what we're doing. Right, so can we see these are the divs here? There's 15 of them. And immediately, as soon as we made our grid container, as soon as we put display grid on our grid container, we have now created a grid. Now we can't see yet our grid because we have to set up the grid based on this basic idea. So here's the difference between Flexbox and CSS Grids. A Flexbox is one-dimensional layout. So you have your elements here. So we have in this picture, we have 3 elements, and we lay them out according to one axis, yeah? Now that axis might flow into the next line, but it's still one axis, it's one-dimensional. And so you can spread out your elements over that one axis. You can kind of move them up and down in relation to that axis, but it's just one axis. With CSS Grid, you have 2 axes. Yeah, you have an X and a Y axis, which means you can lay out your elements in both directions. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to build our grid, setting up the different rows and columns. And you'll see immediately what happens. So the way we do that is we type grid template columns. And let's say we want to have a grid that has 5 columns, yeah? And we want each column to be 150 pixels wide, okay? So I'm gonna write 150 pixels 5 times in a row. Okay. Now, can you see immediately it's made a grid? Yeah? And that grid is made up of 5 columns, each of which is 150 pixels wide. We can also set the rows, although as you see, the rows have been created automatically for us, but we can set them ourselves. So let's go grid template rows, and we'll do the same thing. Okay, and now can you see those rows have been created. Now they're slightly taller, and that may be something to do with the padding. I'm not sure. Let's see if that changes. No, never mind. So we've made now a grid, and you can see there that it's something that is immediately very powerful, but it has limited usability because if we close our browser window, it basically is a static grid. Can you see? It doesn't really do much. It's not flexible, it's not responsive, it's not anything like that. But here's where the fun really starts, because the grid, it doesn't just provide us with 2 new kind of, or 3 new attributes. Like Flexbox, as soon as you write display grid on your container, it opens up a whole world of new properties which you can use. So we're just going to go through some of them. And it's not just properties as well, which allows you to control the behavior of your grid and the grid items, the children, but you also have access to new units, new functions, and certain keywords which allow you to do things that you could never even have dreamed of before, like I said. So Grid is very, very clever and is very, very flexible. The first new thing that it gives you is the possibility for using new units. Now, you're familiar with relative units, are you not? Like percentages and things like that. as opposed to absolute units, which are like pixels?
Yes, we've worked a bit with relative units.
Okay, so what we could do is, if we wanted to divide, this is the reason I did 5 rows. If we wanted to, instead of doing 150 pixels, we wanted to divide the whole width of the browser into 5 parts, that would be 5 lots of 20%, yeah? So instead of writing 150 pixels, if we wanted it to be fully responsive and flexible, we would just do 20% 5 times, yeah? And we'll leave the rows as they are. So now immediately we see this is improved, yeah? So now it's completely flexible. But the problem is that this 20% doesn't really help us if we want to do certain things, such as if we wanted to add a margin or something like that, it will kind of cause problems. So what Grid provides us is it provides us with a new kind of unit which does all of the heavy lifting for you. So 20% is actually not a very flexible unit. It might be a relative unit, but it's set absolutely to 20% of the width of the container. So if anything else is added to that or gets in the way, then it will kind of break your design. So what we have instead of this is something called a fractions unit. And what it does is it will do all of the calculations for you and make sure that your design never breaks. It will always fit it in according to the proportions and the fractions that the browser calculates rather than what we've calculated. So when we set 20%, we are the ones doing the calculation. We are saying, I want this column to be 20% of the width. And whatever the width is, it will be 20% of that. Whereas the FR unit is completely fluid, and it's based on certain calculations that the browser does, which is always adjusting to make sure it never breaks. So if we replace those 20% with one FR, what's it doing here now? It looks exactly the same, but it's calculating it very differently. So the outcome's the same, but we'll see a little bit. Oh, what happened? Sorry. We'll see a little bit further down the line just how powerful the FR unit can be. But in short, there is no more reason anymore in a grid context to use percentages, because the FR unit is the go-to unit. And the FR unit works very similar to, remember when you're doing Flexbox and you went into the flex items and you set the number, the flex value according to a number, and they were relative to each other. It's the same basic idea. So if I put this one to 2FR, what will happen is that the width of this column now, the first column, will be equal to twice that of all of the columns that have one FR set. And I can do the same. Let's say I want the final one to be 3FR. It recalculates everything now, and it spreads out basically the whole of the width of that container. It divides it up equally so that each one takes a fraction based on the fraction's value, the FR unit's value. Are there any questions at this point? Brilliant. I'm not going to assume it means that everyone understands. It could be that we're still shy or we're completely lost, but I'm going to take that as a note of encouragement to proceed. So this is our first basic example. I'm going to put this back to 1FR. And what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to switch. I'm going to switch the view. So it's to the side. Yeah, this is slightly more helpful, yeah? This view.
Yeah, much better.
Yeah. So we've seen immediately that it's not the grid. CSS Grid doesn't just give us the possibility to create a grid and lay out our items according to the grid. It gives us immediately lots of different ways to manipulate those items on the grid. And here's a very, very, very fundamental principle of CSS Grid. There are two different there are two different grids, basically. And when I say two different grids, I don't mean that they exist differently. That the one is a continuation of the other. But there is what we call the explicit grid and the implicit grid. So CSS Grid is so clever that even if we designate a very limited smaller grid, if it finds that there are grid items that don't fit onto the grid that we have specified, which is the explicit grid, it will continue creating the grid. It will continue the grid in order to accommodate those other elements. So let's reduce down our grid dramatically. So I'm going to delete the rows completely.
Tim, can I pass a question to you? Can you undo the line that you just deleted for a second?
Sorry.
So we have a question. Patrick asks, why do you have 5 values for the grid template rows when there are only 3 rows visible? So just before you erase that line, can you?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it kind of connects with what I'm explaining now as well, because the grid. Let's take a little break and see the grid. At the moment, we are not looking at the grid. What we are looking at is actually the grid items that have been placed onto the grid. So let's take a look at the grid. So the reason why I tried to use Firefox, but then I had to change because it wasn't working with Google Meet, is because it has the best grid inspector. But Google Chrome has now included a grid inspector. So let's go and see what that looks like. Where's the full screen of this? Is there a way to view this full screen? There used to be.
Yeah.
I thought it was in. No, that's the layout.
In settings, probably.
No, I don't think so.
Let me. I think it's because you have a limited width now, and it's kind of hidden.
Okay, well, let's try and use inspect, and I don't know what's going to happen with all of it.
Tim, I think you can. You have to save the code pen first of all.
Yeah.
And once it gives you a
here we are. You're right.
And now you can see the full page view.
Okay, so let's go into full page view. Thank you very much, Costa. So we're now in full page view. And I'm going to go inspect. Yeah, you guys all know how to do that, yeah? So we're in Google Chrome at the moment, and I'm using the developer edition, Google Chrome Canary. And what you'll see is we have here our grid container, yeah? And one second, I hope this is going to work. I've never actually used their grid inspector, but for some reason I can't see it.
Maybe there's the 2 arrows next to the DOM breakpoints. Maybe it's over there somewhere.
No, it's not going to be. No. Let me see if I can open this in Firefox. But I'm only sharing. Let me go and I'm going to have to go back and share my screen differently. I'm going to stop presenting and share my whole screen. Okay. Can you see now my screen?
Nope, not yet. Now it's starting.
Oh, it's starting now. Okay.
Yeah. We can see.
Okay.
Firefox.
All right, let's go back in now and see. Sorry, these little hiccups happen along the way. So let's go to inspect elements. And let me just stick this onto the doc to write. Sorry, I entered responsive design mode by accident. How do I get out of this? Ah, here we are.
Just click the, yeah.
No, it's not letting me get out of it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't actually matter. I can stay in responsive design mode. So when you're in Firefox and you go to, you find your grid container. Let's go and find it. Here we are. Now, can you see here next to this, it says grid. Can everyone see that, yeah? It's quite, it might be quite small. I'll try and make it larger. Yeah? Can you see when I clicked on that, immediately something appeared. I'm gonna make this slightly smaller so that we can see a little bit better. Okay, can everyone see the purple lines?
Yep.
Sorry, this thing, responsive thing is actually quite annoying because it's not actually.
If you check, if on the top bar that it says responsive, maybe if you change the setting, it's on the left where it says responsive. No, go to the far left.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. No, it's just. Okay.
I thought this is exiting responsive mode, but 1 second.
I think by clicking the mobile blue icon, it used to.
Yeah, that's what I thought as well, but sorry, 1 second, guys. When you're live code, there's only one person who does in the world who does live coding perfectly. Who is that, Costa?
Leah Veru.
Leah Veru, yeah. She's the only one who does it perfectly. Everyone else messes up. I don't know why this doesn't allow me to get out of responsive design.
We found a bug in Firefox.
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense. It's when I click the X here, it should allow me to. Okay, I'm gonna quit Firefox. Drastic measures. And let's go open it up again. Sorry guys, I just wasted a little bit of everyone's time.
No problem. This is real life.
Yeah.
We want to be real life developers, not.
Okay, I'm gonna go very carefully now and not click the wrong thing, just in case I get into responsive design mode. Okay, so now, now it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, or not. Anyway, what will I want to see more of this. Ah, here we are. Ah, okay, that's working now. So can everyone see my screen? So can you see here this tab that says layout in the inspector? Now there are lots of different ways of getting your grid up. You can click on this grid thing here. You can click on this grid icon here. Can everyone see it? This little cross grid icon. Or in the layout inspector, you find your main grid container and you click the checkbox here. So all of a sudden it reveals your grid to you. And I'm just going to make it small again. So the grid are the purple lines. Now the grid doesn't exist anywhere apart from as like a framework, yeah. But what it does is it forces your HTML elements to fall into line based on that framework that you created. So it's completely invisible. But we can make it appear here in the inspector. So this is also one of the great ways to explain the difference between implicit and explicit grid. So what is revealed now is the explicit grid. This is the grid that we've created, yeah? But look what happens if we reduce the number of, the size of our explicit grid, and let's say it becomes 2 by 2, our grid. Two by 2. Can you see here now, our explicit grid is 2 by 2. It's 2, yeah? And only those first 4 elements are obeying the explicit grid. But what's happened is, because there are more elements than the size of our grid only has 4 cells, yeah? What the grid, CSS Grid, has done is it's created more grid cells. It's continued our grid for us in order to accommodate those other elements. So these 4 here are the explicit grid, and the rest of this here, from this cell onwards. Why is it's going crazy? Okay, from this cell onwards, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way up until 16, which doesn't have an element. Those are all part of the implicit grid. And there are ways that we can control the implicit grid as well, because you can see it has different values. The explicit grid, which we've set the values for, and the implicit grid. And the way we do that is by setting the value of grid auto. Let's say we want the same height on all of them. So if we set it to 100 pixels, what we're saying there is we're telling the implicit grid that when it makes new rows, for all of those rows to be 100 pixels tall. Yeah? So let's go back now to our original grid, to our code pen. And to our, sorry, the editor view is already up here. Okay, any questions at this point? Right, now look at some of the ways that we can control the way those items are laid out on the grid. So you notice here that based on the rows and columns that we've created, that each HTML element falls automatically into one cell. So here's where we need to start looking at terminology. I don't want to bog you down in all different kinds of terminology, but you need to understand certain things. So if you're making notes, this might be a good idea to do it. This might be a good point to do it. We've already spoken about the grid container, which is the way we start the whole thing off, and the grid items, which are the HTML elements inside the grid. Yeah. Now, if we go back to the grid inspector, can you see these numbers here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It goes all the way down. Yeah, and then you also have these minus numbers. I'll explain those later. Those are what are known as grid lines, and they are exactly what you think they are. They are the lines of your grid in between the different parts of it. Then after that, we have grid cells, which is each individual cell. You can see them here. These are all different cells. And then we have, connected to the idea of cells, we have the idea of a grid area. A grid area is when you designate several cells together to be a larger area. So I might designate these kind of 4 cells to be one grid area. And you'll see how that works later on. Then we have grid tracks, which is all the way up and down a row or a column. So this is a grid track, and then this is a grid track as well. And then tracks are the generic name for what we call columns and rows. And then the final thing to bear in mind is the idea of the gap or the gutter. So let's just see what that looks like. So if we go gap, let's say half a rem, and we open up a gap. So that gap is nothing to do with padding or anything like that we've set on the original elements. That has been created for us by by CSS Grid.
Tim, I don't know if this is a good point to pass a question to you, about the shortcut of writing multiple values with a shortcut. So there's a question. So
we will get there, but
okay.
the way that I approach shortcuts is that I want to make sure that everyone understands the individual properties first, and so that when we combine them into a shortcut declaration, we don't get too confused. Okay. I have a shortcut saved for us all, but it won't make any sense at all until we actually look at all the individual properties one by one.
Okay.
But yeah,
I think I'm talking specifically about the, let's say, the fractions, the 5 times that you place the one FR, one FR.
Oh yeah, that's to do with the functions. Okay, actually, this might be a good point to do that specific one. Okay, so can you see here, when we have, we said that CSS Grid, remember we said it provides us with new properties to be able to manipulate the grid and the grid items, new units such as FR, keywords, which we'll see later, and then the final one is functions. Now, a function is a keyword with brackets, and that allows you to do certain things, and they're very, very powerful. And the most basic one that we use quite frequently in CSS Grid is what we call the repeat function. So when I see that I have 5 columns and they're all the same size, what I can do is, instead of writing 5 times the same value, I can use the repeat function. And the repeat function is very straightforward. You write repeats and then brackets, and then you write the number of columns you want, comma, and the size. So I want 5 columns, and then I write a comma, and then I write 1 FR, and that's identical to what I just wrote before. See? And I can do the same thing here. So before, remember, I went and I changed, I wanted to make the size slightly different. So I went in and I changed every single one of them, of the 150 to 100. Using the repeat function, I can actually do that all together. So now they've all become 100, or all 5 rows are 100, or 120, and they change all together, rather than going in and changing each row individually. Yeah, so yeah, that was a very good point. This is the ideal point to introduce the repeat function, Costa. Thank you.
Thank you too.
So can you see, I don't want us to get bogged down in too much information. So I'm trying to kind of just go very, very gradually, so we can see that if you guys forget what happens, what we talk about later on in the lesson, that's okay, as long as you understand the basic idea that this is what grid is, and this is what it does, and this is how I make a basic grid. So far, I just want us to note, we've managed to create what we're seeing in front of us with just 4 declarations. Yeah, it's extremely powerful, the CSS Grid. And let's just see some of the other ways that it's how powerful it is. So once we've created our grid, we can start placing our content on the grid however we want. That is the main selling point of CSS Grid. So at the moment, CSS Grid has automatically placed our content for us. But we can do it however we want, and we can do it like Flexbox altogether, or manually, or a combination of the two. So remember, on Flexbox, we had things like, justify content, where you can kind of move all of the items, center them or put them to the side, or flex direction, where it changes the direction of the elements. So we can do a similar thing with CSS Grid in terms of how we place the content. So there's something called Grid Auto Flow, and this has to do with how it places those items automatically. So the default is row, and what that means is that it will automatically place each HTML item in one cell, and it will lay them out first, going along each row. So can you see, it's taken the first div, this number 1, and it's placed it in the first element on the first row, the first cell, sorry, of the first row. Then it's continued along that row, placing the second div, number 2. But we can change that behavior, and we can say, I don't want you to place the items going along the rows, but going along the columns, which means, and this is coming back to Patrick's question, it will place 5 divs going down before it gets number 6, and number 6 will now appear next to us. So the way we do that is we change this from row to column. And look what happens now. You see, it's now placed those elements automatically again. We haven't changed that behavior. It's still automatic, not manual, but it's changed the behavior, and it started by laying them out along the columns rather than the rows. And there's a third option, which we won't see yet, which is called dense, but that's slightly more advanced. So we can place items on the grid any way we want. Let's change this back to row. And I'm going to put a note here that this is the default behavior. And I'm going to
I think, Tim, you can just move the CSS panel all the way up. I mean, we've already seen the HTML structure. Thank you.
This is teamwork, guys. So I'm going to leave that declaration in there, but I've put a note next to it just to say this is the default behavior. But it's good to see it to remind you that this is referring to how the items are automatically flowed into the page. Okay, now this is where the really fun stuff starts. So we can start now laying out the columns individually any way we want across the grid. And the most basic way of doing that is by using grid lines. So remember I said to make a note of the different terms. When we go, let's go back to this grid here, and let me just let me get back to the original one. Okay, so let's reveal our grid, and we can see here the grid lines again. I'm going to remove that padding. It's not necessary. I'm going to put a little bit of Flexbox here, guys, just to help us. So instead of padding, I'm going to put this. I'm going to use grid here.
You want to center the numbers?
Yeah. I'm not going to use grid. That'll confuse you. I'm going to use. How do we center it? How do we center those numbers, guys?
Yeah, teamwork. Come on. We've seen that.
Questions?
You can open your mic.
Someone wants to suggest something? Well,
justify content center, says Patrick. And then there's... That's on the first axis, and the second axis.
The first letter.
The second letter, maybe they align items center.
Brilliant.
Yep.
Brilliant. Well done,
Thank you, Kiuri.
Sorry, I'm a real stickler about line items. I'm a real stickler about getting my code aligned, but that's just me. Anyway, with grid, it gets complicated because the properties are so long-winded.
You are the Mr. Monk of CSS.
Mr. Monk, yeah. It's helpful for me. You know, each person works the way that suits them best. So, okay, so let's go back now. Let me save that and go back to what I wanted to show you. Okay, so let's reveal our grid. And now we can see here those lines. These lines are going to come into play. So grid line 1 of column 1 is here. It's on the left-hand side. grid line 2 is here for the columns, and then here is number 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have 6 grid lines in our explicit grid. Now let's say I want to take number 1, and number 1 is my footer, yeah? And I want that to be laid out across the whole length of the page, yeah? So how would I do that? Now I need to go into my HTML now and do some. Do you guys have you used nth child, or is that going to be confusing?
No, but I think we can manage it.
You think? Okay, because it's going to be easier than just writing classes. So if we go to number 1, and it's going to be obvious in the code anyway. So if we go to div, this is really bad. I would never do this, just writing div on its own. But it's just so it doesn't get too noisy. So if we go div nth child 1, and one really easy way that I use to work out if these nth child declaration selectors are working is I just go display none and see if it disappears. So if it disappears, oh, there it goes, then I've got the right selector. Some other people just go background red or something like that.
Or hot pink.
Or yeah, well, hot pink is my, yeah, well done. I don't know how that missed me so far. So we're targeting our first, this div nth child. And the way that we can lay out things is by using those line numbers. So if I go grid, column, and then I say I want to start at column 1. Why is it not saving? Okay, I want to start at column 1, and then I write slash, and then where do I want to end? I want to end at the very end, which, remember what line number was that? Does anyone remember? Number 6, yeah? Number
6, yes. Patrick, thank you.
So if I go 6, and we'll see immediately that grid item now has extended all the way across. Now, I didn't need to do anything about the rows because it's still behaving according to its default behavior, which is that it just extends over one grid row. But I can change that as well explicitly, like manually. So grid row, I can go 1 to 2 is what it is already. So if I go 1 to 3, it will now extend over 2 grid rows. Yeah. And now here I have something like a hero element or something like that, you know. And you can see as well that all of the other grid items, they just behave and they just go where they're told to go according to the automatic flow of the grid. So you can see immediately how much power you're starting to have. Now there's a very cool trick which I want to show you, which is we can use the grid lines and not just, it's important to use all of the grid lines because it's very, very helpful. So we have one here, and this grid line has, each grid line has two numbers, sorry. This is 1, and it's also -6, because you count from both sides of the explicit grid. So this is called 6, but it's also -1 because it's the first line of the opposite side of the grid. So you have these minus numbers. Can you see there? It's at the bottom, sorry. Can everyone see it there at the bottom? So this line has two names. It's line number 6 and line number -1, which means that you don't have to count. If I want to extend from the one side to another, I know that I can always write 1 and -1, and it will always go to the other side. Or if I want it to stop short 1 before the end, and again, I can't remember how many there are, and I can't be bothered to count, I can just go 1 to -2, and it will stop 1 before the end. Can everyone see that? So it's a very, very helpful trick, and you're causing yourself a lot more work. You're creating more work for yourself by going each time and counting all of the line numbers, when actually very often you can just count, you can just find one end and then just work out automatically what the other one is going to be. So that's one very helpful trick. The next trick is, let's go to number 2. Let's say I want number 2 to extend down 3, yeah, or 4, all the way down here, yeah. I want it to go down 4 cells. So this is, sorry, let's go to. There. I'm now targeting that second div, the one with the number 2 in it. And I'm going to go now grid row, and I want to go from the top, number 1, and I want it to go, so I haven't written the rest of it yet. I want it to go down, we said 4. So instead of counting the numbers, if I know I just want it to go down 4 rows, I can just go right span 4. Yeah, and I think if we write it like this, then it's like no. Yeah, I need to. Very often, you need to go back and read the documentation to remember the syntax. But this is the quickest way of writing it, basically. But I wanted to make it more explicit and designate where it starts. And I just can't remember how you do that right now. But there are so many things in there that you're gonna be having the documentation next to you all the time. And I'm going to send you some links towards the end of the class, which will give you that documentation. So can you see here this handy trick where you don't have to write line numbers at all sometimes if you don't want to, because if you're starting from its default position and you just want to extend it, then you can do it like that.
Tim,
yeah,
can you please write the other syntax on the first line so we can see the span 4, but also the alternative syntax?
But yeah, the identical, yeah.
Yeah, just to have the.
So this is doing exactly the same thing. So if I comment this out, we'll see that it doesn't change. Oh, now that's interesting. Can you see what it's done there? It's actually done something quite greedy. So sometimes, so this is a very interesting thing. Sometimes when you set something explicitly, when you place something on the grid explicitly like this, you need to do both row and columns. So we have to now, in order to fix this, we have to remind it of where it's supposed to be. So I'm going to do it backwards now. So I'm going to go -1 to -2. Okay, it's back where it's supposed to be. But can you see there, I counted from the other side. Instead of counting from the left and going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I knew it started all the way on the far side of the explicit grid. So I just counted backwards and I go 1, 2. Yeah? But these two declarations are identical now to this, but it only works because the span 4 assumes that we're not changing the position of the default position. We're just taking it from where it normally would be and spanning it down 4 cells, spanning it across 4 cells. Any questions at this point?
We don't have anything from the chat. One thing I would like to note here, you can always ask and open your mic if you want. One thing I have to note now is that on line 24, Tim is using a different comment syntax because he's using he's not using CSS. He's using a language called SCSS. Yeah. We will be going through SCSS in a later lesson. But right now, keep this in mind. He's using this alternative syntax for the comments because he's using a different language. Yeah. So if we were to do this in CSS, we would write exactly the same things. Yes, but we would use the same syntax, the one that we see above. So don't get confused.
Yeah. Let me put it in the proper syntax because that was very naughty of me. I write everything in SCSS, so I just got used to it. But SCSS is an extension of CSS, and I use maybe 1% of it. But that 1% is so useful that and what happens is you write it in SCSS and it compiles back into CSS. But the differences, based on how I use it, are virtually non-existent. Basically, I just use it to combine files together. That's the main reason I use it. Let's see what else we can do. So we've said you can place your items on the grid according to the numbers. So let's do one more example. Let's take this. Sorry.
Tim, sorry, there is a question by Selena. So she asks, so span works only across lines? The grid
span,
rows?
Span will stretch out a grid item in any direction. So if you put the span on the row, it will stretch it out over a row. If you put it on a column, it will stretch it out over a column. So let's do that. Let's.
And I have to note here that the span, it's just the CSS grid value. It doesn't have anything to do with the span HTML element. So Selena, we're talking about different spans here.
Yeah, let me just show you something. So we've extended it out of the row, but let's say we want it to become bigger to extend over 2 columns as well. So at the moment it's extended over 3 rows vertically, but if we want to span it over 2 columns as well, we would just write span 2. Let's see what happens. Okay, so can you see what's happened? Because this one element doesn't allow it to span, it doesn't allow it to kind of it finishes here. It's actually pushed it to the next line. But don't think that grid is so weak. It's actually powerful enough to accommodate what we were trying to do. But you can't do it with span. You basically need to be, like I said before, you need to be more explicit in order to accomplish the effects that you want. So I'm just going to delete all of this. And if we want to do what we just did, we would write grid row.
Sorry, Tim, just to cut you there. Can you undo and just keep the lines commented so that we have a reference later?
Yeah, sure. Okay, let me just, I'm gonna use this because it's quicker. Sorry. Sue me. So we got grid row. I'm basically going to write what we had before. And then we got grid column -1, and now -3, and look what happens. Okay, that wasn't supposed to happen. Okay, why has this happened? I said, when we are explicit, it will do what we say. So why hasn't it done what we've said? It has done, the number 2 is done, but now, instead of the number 2 being pushed to a different position to where we asked it to be, number 1 has been pushed. So what do we need to do to fix this? Any ideas? So the answer is just we haven't explicitly set the rows on the number 1. So if we set the rows number 1 and we say 1, 2, 2, it will now overlap. You see? So overlapping used to be something that was incredibly difficult to do. To have overlapping items in HTML. You would have to play around with all kinds of different things. Whereas now it's a piece of cake. It's extremely, extremely easy because you can place anything wherever you want on the grid. And it will, if you're not explicit enough, it will revert to the default behavior, and it will flow things maybe in ways that you didn't want it to. But at the moment you actually set something, you say explicitly, this is what needs to happen, it will comply. So I'm not sure how much sense this is going to make now, but yeah. should we leave it in the original? I just wanted to show you that to show you that you can overlap, but let's not make it too confusing, okay? So we'll just leave it like that for now.
So Nikos asks, 1 or 2 is on top.
In that case, you would use z-index. So let's make these opaque in order to show what's going on. So
Great question.
It will do it according to source order initially. So according to the HTML, the order that they're in HTML. And so let's just see what that is. The default is that the elements that come later in the source order are going to be on top. Yeah, but we can now then just manipulate that using z-index. So z-index 1, and basically all you need to do is activate z-index on the element that that you want to be on top. And if the other doesn't have a z-index at all, it will just it will go underneath. But if you wanted to have more fine-grained control, then you would set it on both, just to be absolutely sure that you're in control. Okay. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So moving swiftly on. Now that is just one way of laying out the grid. Oh, sorry, I want to do one more thing. Let's say we wanted to take number 3, and we wanted to put it somewhere else completely differently. So let's say we want number 3 to go down here. Now there are very few examples of when you would actually want to do this, but just because we can, let's do it. So I want number 3 to fill the area that was formerly filled by 12 and 13. Yeah. So let's go div and child 3. And can someone tell me what I need to write in order to get it to this position? You can write it in the chat or...
Tim, you can show your screen so that they see the layout, and I will let you know if anyone's asking. But you can also use your microphone. And this is a tricky one, I must admit.
What do you say, guys?
Just ideas, suggestions.
Suggestions, yeah.
So 0 says Chetin, maybe 0, but what
0.
kind of property?
So just use lines, what we've already seen. How do we get it there? Well, let me start the first one. So if I say I write grid row, what line numbers do I need to put here in order to get it down here? So to start here at this grid line and end at this grid line.
Kevin, people, just a number guessing game.
Yeah.
Four. So let's try 4.
4 as the first number, and
the second up to -2 says Selena.
-2. Okay, let's try that. Where did it go? Oh wow, that worked. Now that's a very good. I think it's unnecessary to use -2 in this instance because we're just spanning one cell. So we don't actually need to work it out. If it's just one cell, it's 4 to 5. That's what I would do there. But well done on the correct answer. And how do we get it from down here all the way over here and spanning over 2? So we go grid, column. What number?
Kiuri says 4 -1.
And -1. Perfect.
Yeah.
Can you see? Brilliant. Well done, guys. So can you see we have complete control over where all of our elements are and how big they are and how much of the grid they fill. Now you can imagine that if you start playing around with all these numbers all the time, things can get very confusing, especially when the logic of HTML and CSS runs along, creating readable code, class names that make sense according to what we're building and the logic of the page. So there is another way to do it. And this is using not grid lines, but grid areas. So the way that we make grid areas, or the most basic way is, and it's not in conflict with making our columns and rows, this is an addition.
So sorry, Tim, sorry to intervene. Maybe is it possible to fork and use a different version to see the grid area so that we have both, like?
Yes. Let me just fork. Here, is it here?
I think in settings.
No. Oh, it's down here. Sorry, I remember.
Mm-hmm. So now we're creating a copy of the previous code pen so that we have both links.
And we're going to call this areas. Okay, so I'm going to delete all of this other stuff here with the numbers. Okay, now we have our original grid here. So we ignore this stuff. That's just for the code that we are concerned with is this. So we still have the same grid. It's a 5x5 grid. And we have, I'm going to delete this now because it's not necessary. And what we're going to do now is we're going to create our areas. Now, you can see, brilliant, CodePen is great, and all of the editors, Visual Studio Code and stuff like that. When you're writing a property that it doesn't exist, it will give it a different color. So then now it finds this property exists, so it will tell you that it exists. So the way that you do this is by visually laying out your columns and rows and giving them names. So names that you understand. So we're not dealing in line numbers anymore, and we're not dealing in line numbers at all, although we will be in a minute using this kind of areas setting. But we're actually giving names to the tracks. Remember the terminology again? These are the lines, and then the tracks are the kind of the rows or the columns in between the lines. Yeah, the whole thing. So what we do is we describe or we give names to all of the different tracks. And what we do is each row is encapsulated by inverted commas, yeah, or sorry, quotation marks, by quotation marks. So this is our first row that we're making now, and so we need, and we're not naming each different column. We're actually creating the areas that we want. So this is an example. So let's say we have a header here. We want this header to fill all 5 rows. And actually, let's make this slightly smaller so it's easier to deal with. So let's make this 4 by 4. Okay, so now what do we have? We have anything that has the same name is part of the same area. So what we've done is we've created one row, yeah, which has 4 columns, and that is one grid area. Okay, so the way that we understand that is, if we go to grid area header, look what happens. we see? So we don't have to mess around with lines and counting or anything like that. We've described exactly what we want our grid to look like, and we've designated how much of the grid the header is supposed to fill. And so then all we need to do afterwards is write down in the header. So then we can continue making our grid. So we go to the next row, and we say on this row, we want to have our main, and we want it to fill 2 columns. And then, no, so 3 columns, and we want our aside to fill 1 column. So that now is 4 more columns, but 3 columns are filled by the main, and one column is filled by the aside. And actually, we want this to persist for 2 rows. So now you can see this here, all of this main area, the main grid area, extends across 3 columns and 2 rows. And that's 1 grid area. So now look how simple it is. Let's say we take the second one, the div 2. And we want that to be our main our main grid area. And div 3. It's going to be our aside. And we have, oh, what happened there? Oh,
you have the same number on
the same number. And we have there a classic layout. Yeah, can you see? It's one of them, the most common kind of layouts that you'll see. And look at how easy it was to make. We didn't have to mess around with measurements, with anything. It's completely responsive. It's completely flexible. It never breaks, whatever you do to it. And it was that simple. And the key thing about grid areas is that they're easy to understand. Yeah, sorry?
There's a question by Selena. I'm not sure I understand. She asks, can we use span between names also? Span meaning the HTML element. So I guess she's referring to grid template areas. Is that right, Selena?
No, sorry, hi. I mean, we used span before between numbers that were referring to rows and columns. So now that we named these areas, can we use, for example, span to go from the first header to the last one, or from the header to main and include the first main and include this, let's say, cell also? Using names, I don't know if I'm clear.
The basic idea is that using grid areas is an alternative way to laying out to grid lines. So you can still use grid lines for other parts of the grid. You can mix and match. So we can take like number 4 and spread it out a lot on the grid as well. Like, we're not bound that since we've written this, we don't have to use it at all. It's just there as a way, as a template. Can you see? That's why it's called template areas. We only start using it when we assign it to an HTML element. But we don't have to use template areas just because we've made the template. We can mix and match. So we can say, using grid column and grid row for everything else. So let's say I want to put this up here. What happened here? No, that wasn't supposed to happen. Oh, because I did grid column instead of grid row, sorry. Yeah, can you see? So I can mix and match. For the first 3 elements, I'm using grid area. For the fourth element, I've used the grid row column. Now, I don't know if this is anything to do with your question, but when you use span, again, you need to be explicit. And there is a way to be explicit with span, but I can't remember. I can't remember very much. So maybe if I write span, yeah, okay, so what it's done there, yeah, so this is the way to be explicit. Yeah, so if you use this syntax with the slash, then where you've written span, you look at the other value first, because if the other value is the second value, then what it's saying is this nth child, this fourth element, it will end at grid line 4 in terms of its rows, and then you look at the span where you put the span, and you'll say, and it will extend up 1, because this is the ending. So if you reverse these and you put 4 and then 1 span 1, I think, you see it's doing the opposite. It's starting at grid line 4 and spanning down 1. Yeah. So I've just switched the values, and it's doing the same thing, but it's changing position because I've changed the starting point of the span. So if the span comes second, it will span downwards, and if the span comes first, it will span upwards. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it was pretty clear. The answer, the question was, if I put header and let's say define the first line, if I can do what you did now using the numbers of rows and columns.
Yeah, you can do it, but it's an alternative solution. So if I don't want to use grid area, I can't include span in the grid area property. I have to, if I want to use span, I have to use the grid row or grid column. I have to use the other way of doing it using grid lines. Yeah?
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, there is a way to combine it, which is, and this is where things get complicated. So I was wondering about whether to show or not, but I think I will. So in this kind of grid template area that you're creating, which again is just a template, where you're describing not just the grid, but you're actually describing the areas of the grid. You can also give the lines names. Yeah. So at the moment, the line numbers all exist, but they are numbered. They don't have any other kind of way of referring to them. So no. Actually, it's even more clever than that. So the moment you create grid areas, the line numbers, the lines receive names based on the areas that you've created. So now this is implicit again. I don't have to write this. So just to give you an idea, look at this. I have this grid area header. Yeah. Now I can write using the other syntax, but look how I can do it now. The old way is to say grid column 1 minus 1. That's the way that we already know. Yeah. But because I have this grid area, if for whatever reason I wanted to use this syntax, I could actually write header starts and header. Is that the correct syntax, Costa? I guess we'll see in a moment.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Can you see? It
you caught me off guard.
Yeah. So these names, header starts and header end, are automatically generated, and they correspond to the line number that comes here and the line number that comes here. So this is actually quite advanced, and I wouldn't want to continue because I think we'll spend too much time on this, and I want to show a couple of more examples before we finish. Is it okay to extend slightly over the time and end like after 3, or do we have to end at 3?
From me, it's okay. From me, it's okay. I don't know about the rest of you.
Is it okay to go on another 10-15 minutes after 4 o'clock?
We also recording the session, so if someone...
Okay.
Also, Tim, I would like you to, since we have a little bit of extra time, to go to Google Meet and open a link I sent and show the screen and maybe show the students. Yeah. Like, I think it's really nice because it shows with the colored sections the grid template areas.
Yes.
So maybe you can walk us through and just...
Okay, so yeah, so what it's doing here. Okay, so here we've seen a grid, another example of a template area. Can you see that it gets slightly confusing because this row has the same number of columns as this second row, but because it's using smaller names, you know, X and Y rather than as opposed to X, center, and W, it looks like kind of longer, but it's exactly the same. You can see both of them have 5 columns. But what we're seeing here is, again, visually, you're seeing how you're able to place items according to the rows, according to the areas that you've created. I think it's actually very self-explanatory here. So what you're doing is you've got this first div, which is, don't ever write style in your HTML, please, but it's useful for this explanation. You've got the grid area X, Y, Z, W. So one of the ways to kind of make sure that you are able to write code that doesn't kind of spill over into like go on forever is by making these smaller names. But for me, it kind of defeats the point because the whole point of having grid areas is to have something that's slightly more descriptive. But there is a good discussion to be had there. But yeah, if we can get back to this kind of idea, what you can do, I don't want to go into the line names right now because I think it's something it's a little bit more advanced and it's slightly more confusing, even though it's a straightforward idea. So I think it's best if you kind of read up on that at home, and let's go and look at some real world examples. Okay, so I'm going to delete this because it's slightly confusing. And we're going to save this, and we're going to go into another example, which I think is going to be a bit more fun. So let's make a new one.
Bottom right.
Yeah, I want to make a completely new one, I think. So let me just go back to my main page and make a new pen. So one of the main ways that things that we do at the beginning of a site is when we're setting up a site is we try and limit the width of the content using max width. So what I do very often is I wrap all my content in a div called site width, and then I have my content in here. So we have main, your head, let's say footer. Okay, and let's just kind of give it some colors. So let's say sorry, I'm doing this without classes, which again is don't ever do this, but I'm just doing it so that the code's slightly more readable. But normally I would add classes to all of these. So if you go header, let's do background, pink, main. But we can put this on one line as well, so it doesn't take up as much space, because this is just so we can kind of see what we're doing. There's something called hot rod, I think. There's a color called hot rod, I think. No. You remember
Sky blue is nice.
Sky blue. Yeah, we like that. Okay. So we can. This is just so we can see what we're doing. Okay. Let me just make it ever so slightly nicer. With padding. Okay. So this is just cosmetic style. So now let's go and get into the nitty gritty. So very often in the past and still, I would kind of wrap all of my content inside the body still. You could do it to the body, but it's not best practice. So I would add this extra div, which is just for limiting the site width and censoring it if it's a centered design. So you go to site width, and then you would say max width. Let's make it small because we're working on a small screen, 800 pixels. Smaller than what we have here. Wow. Okay, it needs to be even smaller. Normally it would be something like 1,600 or 1,200 or something like that. But let's have 600. And then, do you guys know the trick for centering something very quickly?
Yes, they do. Come on, guys.
Quick suggestion.
Can you show us the screen, and I'll take a look at the.
So I just want to center the whole thing. This whole site width element.
We saw it yesterday. We had a live session and we used it yesterday. You can also try whatever comes to mind. That doesn't matter. If you remember, can you write the first word, the first character? Okay, margin 0 auto.
Yeah.
It's a block element, so yeah. Thank you, Curie.
Brilliant, thank you. So, what happens here is, the way this works, max width is great because what happens is when it gets to it's completely fluid, yeah. So the element gets smaller, but as it grows, yeah, because it's a block level element, it will fill the width of the whole page. But as it grows, max width means that the width is when it reaches 600, it stops growing. Yeah. So there you go, stops growing, and then with the margin auto, it's censored. But what you're seeing now is you're seeing lots of designs where you have this kind of like full width element in the middle. Yeah. So let's say we have the main, and we want just the main to extend all the way to the end, and we want the other two to be 600 max width.
Can you hit save? Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so one way of doing that is just to apply the site width to each individual element that you want to be centered. But that can get very, very, your code will just fill up with pointless declarations. So one other thing that I saw recently is like using a hacky kind of way to do it. So you would target the main and you would force it to break out. So you would say width 100 VW. Do you guys know viewport units? Have you used them?
We've seen V8s, viewport height. So
yeah, VW is 100% of the viewport width. Yeah. So we've made that now 100 VW, which means the width is the width of the viewports, and then this is very hacky, but you would say left. Sorry, is it margin left? I think you'd say 50%, and then sorry, minus 50%. Yeah, and then translate. Something like translate X. No, sorry, transform. Sorry, it's very hacky. Something like this. I think this should work. No. Anyway, there's hacky ways of doing this, which work, but you can actually use CSS Grid to do this for you. So look at this. Instead of on this site width writing max width, just make the whole thing a grid. And then the gap that you want, you make it into 2 columns that you just don't use. Yeah, so, sorry, grid template columns. You would say, okay, I want my middle column to be, sorry?
The 800 pixel or?
Yeah. Relative? I'm just trying to work out what the best way to do is. So if you put, so you need to, have you guys used calc for this? Have you guys used calc yet? Calc function.
We haven't done it in a live session, but I.
Okay, so maybe this example is a little bit too advanced. Have you used variables?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, look, let's just do the most basic one. Let's say you want to have like a 10% thing, a gap on each side. So what you do is you'd write 10%, and then what you would do then is you would just target all of them, and you would say grid column 2, 3. And so what you have there then is you have it the content kind of doing what you want. That this might actually be a good opportunity to introduce the min-max function, but yeah. Maybe I'll make a separate video to show you this example in all its glory. So we're just going to use a very bare bones version. But let me just show you the thing I wanted to say. So if we take the main, and all we do in order to extend it across the whole thing is we write grid column, and you guys know this, and it extends across the whole thing. So something that was very, very difficult to do before, and it was very, very hacky. You had to kind of find really kind of weird and wonderful ways to do it. That broke with the logic of everything else that you were trying to do. Now it just works perfectly. Yeah, you can extend, you can break, you can kind of gather things across. Let's go to another example. What do we call this example? Let's say full width. Elements with CSS Grid. Okay, let's do one more example, and then we can have some questions. Yeah. Let me introduce you to the to what we call and we can do this actually by going to just by forking the earlier example. So if we go back to our earlier example, this one here, and fork it. So I'm going to introduce you to one of these new functions. We've already seen one of the functions already, which is the repeat function. Yeah, do you remember that one? So I'm going to show you another function here, which is called min-max. And this function is a thing of beauty. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to do something inside our original grid container kind of property. So I'm going to have to. So at the moment, these are all growing. Can you see? And at a certain point, they get very squashed. Can you see? So this is very, very, it might work all the time and never break, but it's not necessarily what we want. Can you see? Like imagine if you have text in there, it's going to be ghastly. So there's one way that we can exercise even more fine-grained control over the way the different elements kind of expand and contract. And there are two things we can do. The first one is use the min-max function. So the min-max function works in a certain, it basically does what it says on the tin. You set through this function the minimum width and the maximum width. So instead of writing 1fr here, what we can do is we can use the min-max function. So it does get confusing because you're using a function inside a function, but bear with me. It's a very, very basic idea. We set the minimum width and then comma and then the maximum width, exactly like we use for the repeat function. So let's say we want the minimum width to be 200 pixels. And then we don't care what the maximum width is. So it's going to be just stick with 1fr. So it can keep extending. So can you see what we've got now? It doesn't, well, let's make it 150 so it fits in better. It doesn't squash it anymore. So it grows as much as we want. Yeah. But as soon as it gets down, smaller, it sticks to 150. Yeah. Now there's a problem there, which is that it actually makes and this is the second way that we can manipulate. So the problem there is that now the page is not responsive anymore. Yeah. Our content is responsive, but it makes the grid to have an absolute size because the width cannot be less than 150 times 5. Does that make sense? Because we've set an absolute minimum width, these cannot shrink down to less than 150. And at the moment, they're being forced to stay in their column because we've said 5 columns. So the default behavior of CSS Grid is each element goes into one cell. So the first 5 elements go into the first 5 columns and they maintain that 150 width. And so the whole kind of container has this minimum size. So there is one thing that we can do to help out the situation. And this it's going to look very, very complicated, but once you break it down into all of its component parts, it's actually very, very straightforward. This is by replacing the number of columns with another function, and that with the keyword, and that keyword is auto fit. Look what happens now. Auto fit basically says, I will automatically create the number of columns the optimum number of columns based on the size of the columns that you set. So look what happens now. As the page gets bigger, because the columns are growing and changing in size, it will automatically make sure that the column that the grid doesn't break, but also that all of the rows are filled up with as many items as they will fit. And what you have here is a fully responsive site without using media queries. Have you guys done media queries yet?
We touched them a bit.
Yeah. So can you see here? Normally, you wouldn't be able to change your layout in this way without using media queries. But CSS Grid is so clever that just by using this keyword, auto fit, it won't have an absolute number of columns anymore. It will change the number of columns dynamically based on the size, which is here, the size that you set. And if that size is changing as well, then you basically have this extremely fine-grained control. But this is the holy grail of CSS layout, combining the repeats function with the auto fit keyword and the min-max function. Now, if you don't understand this declaration, even though we've built it up gradually, because it's the first time you're seeing it, it might be all too much for you. but it's worth just going back and taking this pen and just working your way through it and breaking it back down into its component parts. So remember, we started out, let me just put each component part here so we can see how it's been built up. So we had repeats, 5, 1 FR. That was the first one. And I'm gonna, then we had, that became we replaced the 1 FR with a more dynamic way of sizing the elements so that they don't become too small. So we set a minimum size of 150 pixels. So these cannot be smaller than 150 pixels because they'll be ugly. Yeah. So when they get to 150 pixels, they stop growing in width. But because that caused our whole grid to become too large, because it started to have this minimum width, we said, well, when it becomes too large and it starts breaking out of the bounds of the page, reduce the number of columns so that you'll fit it in properly. And that is with using the autofit keyword. There's another keyword called autofill, and they're almost identical, but they do slightly different things. But we're using autofit here for the moment.
We have a question regarding autofit. So I think you can see it. Does autofit works even when cells are uneven?
It does work. It works all the time. It will always work, but it only works with the. Oh no, you're holding. That's a very good question actually, because we're using it with the repeat function. That is a very good question. Possibly not. You've got me there. Basically, you work this out in the real world, but I think that the repeat function only works. The autofit keyword only is for the repeat function, which means that it would only be on equally sized. Let me get back to you on that one, guys. Sorry.
Thank you, Selena.
Very good question. I think that it's just for the same space, the same size, the kind of things. Are there any questions? We need to kind of bring this to a close, but we've kind of gone from 1 to 100, from 0 to 100 in a very short time. But I hope that you've got not just a grasp of the basic idea, but of some of the possibilities that kind of CSS Grid affords us.
I have a question. Of course, anyone else can post. Or so far I've been teaching and saying that for the layouts that we see out there and the layouts that we probably need to be structuring with CSS, for let's say 8 out of 10 layouts can be created using Flexbox, and then for like the rest of it, we can a little bit more complex layouts, we have to use CSS Grid. So most of the layouts that we see out there, Flexbox is probably all right. It's okay. And then we use CSS Grid for a little bit more complex layouts. Do you think that we can, let's say, completely forget about Flexbox and build everything just using CSS Grid?
The short answer is no. What people traditionally say is use CSS Grid for layouts of larger elements, like whole page layouts or something like that, or larger components. And then Flexbox is kind of more suited to smaller components. But it really depends what you're trying to do. So if you're just trying to spread, remember that it's 1 axis and 2 axes. So if you're just trying to spread some elements out evenly over a line, then Flexbox is usually going to be your go-to tool. And even if it's not completely even, but it's kind of one element kind of breaks out of that, then using those kind of align self or justify self, whatever, those things, they can kind of sometimes get the job done. But the trick for me is, if you think that you have something simple which you can do with Flexbox, the moment you start running into difficulty, that's probably a good indication that you should try to do it with Grid.
Yeah.
There's no hard and fast rule, apart from broadly speaking, CSS Grid is a lot more powerful. So if you need that power, to create this kind of complex layout, definitely, start off with CSS Grid. And if you're doing something very kind of straightforward, but I'm seeing kind of people like just centering things using Grid as well, just because with Flexbox you need 3 declarations. With Grid you need 2. So yeah, it's display grid, place item center.
Okay. Can you place that snippet on the centering with Grid?
Yeah, here, look, it's display grid, place items center.
Wow.
That's it. So yeah, you don't need this text align. It's just two lines.
Amazing.
Yeah, like for these like quick and dirty kind of solutions. So yeah, so like you would think there that Flexbox would be more, because it seems to be simpler, but actually, Grid is more effective for that very, very, quick task. But anyway, yeah, are there any other questions? So we didn't actually get to issues of shorthand, but we ran out of time. Yeah, so any other questions before we bring this to a close?
Well, what I wanted to add before wrapping up, I think, is that today we saw like a really compacted version of CSS Grid and almost all the properties and the values. It's too much information to digest right now. So, but we will unpack this in later lessons when we go into the advanced CSS, and also it would be great for you to just test very simple CSS Grid rules one at a time, so you don't have to try to recreate all these let's say complex layout. You can start just by placing a 4x4 grid, testing the CSS Grid properties one by one, and then moving on forward to the rest of the properties that we saw. So don't feel like overwhelmed, because we saw too many things in just too little time, but you can move on gradually and see each property one by one. So it was an amazing presentation, and it always amazes me that I learned many new things from your presentations, Tim. I always feel like when I watch your presentation, I feel like a CSS really beginner. So yeah, so that we don't take any more of your precious time, we're extremely thankful for your time and your presentation. I will be gathering the notes and the links that we saw today and send it to you through a Google document. Tim, really great. Thank you very much. And I hope we see you in another guest lecture at some point.
Yeah, I'd love to come back.
See your amazing CSS skills. So I think we can wrap up and finish. So goodbye. And
it was great to meet all of you. And sorry it had to be so rushed and packed so that we didn't really get a chance to know each other. But you're in very good hands.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everybody. So we'll see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.